Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today at report stage of Bill C-32 to talk a little bit about the bill. I think one of the really important measures contained in this bill is the Canada Recovery Dividend. We've talked a lot in this place about the impact of the pandemic on people, on the need for government to have spent a considerable sum of money in order to support people as they contemplated losing their home during the pandemic, particularly in those early days when the economy all but shut down, people were put out of work, they weren't sure how they were going to pay the bills. And we've also talked a lot in this place about the amount of financial aid that was made available to large financial institutions and banks right at the outset of the pandemic. And indeed, we've talked about some of the knock-on effects in the economy of providing that liquidity and support and de-risking to major financial institutions. And so the Canada Recovery Dividend is a one-time tax assessed on profits over $1 billion of Canada's largest financial institutions from those early years of the pandemic. It's to be paid over 5 years. It represents a considerable amount of revenue. It's something New Democrats also would have liked to have seen applied to big box stores, grocery stores, oil and gas companies that also saw considerable profits during that period. And by considerable profits, I don't just mean their normal considerable profits, but I mean extra profit above and beyond the normal rate of profit that these companies enjoy. And so while we would have liked to have seen that expanded, and while we continue to ask for that, and while we continue to push for that, nevertheless, there is an important piece of work being done here, which is to assess that Canada Recovery Dividend, or what in other jurisdictions has been called a windfall tax on Canada's financial institutions. It's not something that's been done, to my knowledge, in my own lifetime before. So I think it is a really significant undertaking to go to these large financial institutions that have made a lot of money, that benefited significantly from public funding during the pandemic, and to say that they need to pay their fair share. And oftentimes we talk about folks having to pay their fair share. I mean, New Democrats talk about large companies having to pay their fair share. Rarely do we see actual instances of them being required to do it. This is what that looks like when you do it. And I think our going ahead with it in respect to financial institutions, while that's a positive thing, also just demonstrates the extent to which we're not requiring other large profitable companies to pay their fair share, because they're not mentioned in this legislation. They're not going to do it spontaneously. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. They're not just going to come around. The banks didn't. They're doing it because it's legislated. It should be legislated for those other sectors as well, but nevertheless, it matters that we're doing it for some sectors. And in addition to that, this legislation will also permanently increase the corporate tax rate on those very same companies, the big banks and life insurance companies, from 15% to 16.5%. I think that's also significant. I think that's what it means when we talk about making companies pay their fair share, and it's something too infrequently seen in this place. I would note, for anyone listening at home that's having an outpouring of sympathy for these large institutions, I doubt many, but this is still far less than they paid in the year 2000 when they paid a 28% corporate tax rate. So going up to 16.5% for a small cross-section, albeit a large, powerful and profitable cross-section of corporate Canada, is hardly what we mean when we talk about tax fairness, but it is at least, for the first time in over 20 years, a step in the right direction. And so I'm proud to be rising today to support that step in the right direction. I hope it's the first of many. I know if Canadians see fit to elect a new Democratic government, that it will be. In the meantime, we'll be here fighting and dragging the Liberals, kicking and screaming at every opportunity we get for them to do the right thing and ensure that corporate Canada is paying its fair share. Canadians who want to have a sense of what that looks like have only to look at this bill and see the progress that we're making. There are also some things in this bill that have to do with the housing market. I think ultimately a drop in the bucket, because they're predicated upon the same ethos or philosophy that has been driving the housing market now since the Liberal government of the day in the mid-90s first terminated the National Housing Strategy, which is a commodity-based approach to housing. and a market-based approach to housing. Not because we ever had a time where there wasn't a housing market. There's always been a housing market in Canada, rightly so. But we used to have a housing market in Canada that was about people being able to buy a family home and sell a home when it came time for them to downsize in retirement and have a bit of a nest egg. And that was complemented by a parallel public housing sector that was meaningful, that made real investments and built a significant amount of units every year. That stopped in the mid-90s. We've never really gotten back to that. Now, things like, and things that we support incidentally, like a doubling of the first-time homebuyers tax credit, are things that will make a difference for certain families that are already financially well-positioned enough to contemplate buying a house in this market. Fewer and fewer Canadians belong to that category. Fewer and fewer Canadians belong to that category because of the astronomical increase in the cost of housing. Fewer and fewer Canadians belong to that category because the significant depreciation in their salaries against inflation and the prices of many things. So these are things that I think will make a difference for some Canadians. Some of these things are things that we've advocated for, like the doubling of the first-time homebuyers credit, like cracking down to the extent that the government has in this bill. We will see in time how effective that is and what the loopholes mean, but on things like house flipping and other things that are making it harder for Canadians to be able to compete to get that first home because they're being outbid by people who've made a science of bidding on homes and flipping them, and who are backed with a lot of access to capital that most Canadians don't have the advantage of having ready access to. But nevertheless, these are some things that may help certain Canadians. Fine, there's a lot more work to do to combat the idea that houses are commercial assets as opposed to homes. And there's going to be significant government investment required in order to make that case and to take that framework on so that we're building more social housing units where rent is geared to income. And there's also going to have to be a lot more work to do where the government, not unlike what I was just talking about with assessing real taxes on the biggest corporate players in Canada, there's going to be a lot of work to do in changing the regulatory environment so that big real estate investment trusts and other large corporate players in the housing market that are pushing up prices and evicting low-income tenants don't have a free hand to do that in the way that they have. And that is what it's going to ultimately take in order to live in a country that has made a real decision about its values in respect of housing, so that we say that housing is not a simple market with a good that's just like any other good in the market, but that housing is properly a right for Canadian citizens, and that we have to design our housing market, including using non-market tools, to ensure that everybody has access to housing. This doesn't get us there, but it does tinker at the edges in ways that will be helpful for some people. I want to talk a little bit about what's not in the bill, because we are quite prepared to support this bill on the basis of some of those things that I think are both significant, and then some of the things that tinker at the edges, albeit in, I think, helpful ways as opposed to harmful ways. But there's a lot that wasn't in here, Madam Speaker. I think particularly of employment insurance reform as the government begins to talk about a recession. And we don't see any clues in this bill, just as we didn't see in the fall economic statement, about where the government is going on certain key policy decisions that have to be made in order to get our employment insurance system up to where it needs to be. And I would note, while I have the opportunity before my time runs out, Madam Speaker, that one of the things the government has decided to do that you don't see in this bill, but that is on the books, is they want to attribute $25 billion, that is billion with a B, it's a big number, dollars of debt to the employment insurance account for the CERB and CRB payments that were made under the auspices of Service Canada as opposed to the CRA. And I have to say, whatever the government has in store for EI modernization clearly can't involve any funding, because a $25 billion debt on the EI account means that we are going to see maximum premium increases for the next 7 years, with all of that money going to paying down CERB debt that should not be on the EI account. That was a general expense by government in the context of a global emergency, it shouldn't be on the EI account. Happy to talk more about that in the question and answer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. L'honorable député d'Abitibi.
The honourable member for Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik, EU. I'd like to thank the member for his lovely speech. You'll know that in my large riding, I have many people who call me because they're worried, they don't understand what's going on. Some of them want to be 74 to have a decent pension. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague could give us some suggestions for the government to finally take action. The honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
I'd like to thank the member for her question. I think it's rather simple. The government must apply the increase to the pensions they give seniors that are 75 years or older. They should give it to every senior that is aged over 65 years, because the costs that seniors are experiencing when they're 75 years of age and older are also experienced by seniors that are 65 years and older. These are tough economic times, and there are no exceptions. There shouldn't be exceptions also in terms of the pension increases. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Always a pleasure to rise here in the House of Commons. You know, I guess the question I would have for the member opposite is why should we have any more faith in this government going forward with which he has chosen to partner? They can't deliver on basic programs like passports. How can we ever do something complex like a housing program and things like that, which he so eloquently spoke of? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know, in the last election, Canadians elected 338 different MPs. And it's true. I look at this government and I see a lot of reasons why Canadians shouldn't trust them, and reasons why they may think that this government has failed them. I look across the way and I don't see an adequate replacement. So I think we're stuck, the 338 of us, trying to figure out how to move forward on certain policy items that are in the best interest of Canadians, that are going to make a concrete improvement in their lives. And so I don't think an election is going to accomplish that. What I think is people actually getting serious and dropping some of the rhetoric and looking for ways that, regardless of what party we belong to, we can move forward on good policy issues that are going to make a positive difference in the lives of Canadians. I think if we spend more of our time doing that, Canadians will be far better served than by simply electing another government that is going to have its own problems, frankly. What, inaction on climate change? We're not going to get anything better from them. Tax breaks for big corporations? We're not going to get anything better from them. I could go on, Madam Speaker. I won't, but I could. I'm just going to focus on trying to get things done for people here.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the member spoke about some of the positive items in C32 as well as concerns with what wasn't there. One of those is recognizing that Canadians with disabilities are disproportionately living in poverty across the country, and both C32 and the Fall Economic Statement and the budget before that failed to introduce any kind of emergency response the way that the parliamentarians in this place had done when COVID first hit, and I know he was here for that. So I wonder if the member for Elmwood Transcona, who's been a champion for pushing for better supports for Canadians living with disabilities, could talk about why there hasn't been already and what it would take to get a disability emergency response introduced in this place.
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, frankly, I think all it would take is a little bit of political will from the government, because I think they have enough support with other members in the House to try to come to some kind of meaningful emergency solution for people living with disabilities. They've expressed an intent. We saw that in some previous budgets, not in the numbers, just in the kind of flowery language. And then they introduced Bill C-22 in this Parliament, a lot like a bill from the previous Parliament. Again, frustrating because it has no details about the amount that they intend to pay, about the eligibility criteria. They're not talking about doing anything in the meantime. So one is forced to wonder whether they're serious about delivering a benefit to Canadians living with disabilities who are in dire need right now, or whether it's just kind of talking points. But the political will outside the Liberal Party is adequate in the House in order to implement a solution. What we're waiting on is for the government to care enough to put something on the table so that we can move ahead.